gold trails and ghost towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Well, welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts with you, along with our storyteller, historian, and general factotum, Bill Barlee. How are you doing?
Great, Mike. You'll love the story.
Anytime there is a lost mine story, ears prick up.
Yeah, well, you know, we do about 7% of the stories we get. That's all. There has to be a lot of factual knowledge. There have to be names, dates, and everything else. This has all of that background.
It's one of the legitimate 7.
I think it is. I think it's still there, and it's in an area we know fairly well. It's in that boundary country, and that boundary country, of course, is between the West Coot and the Okanagan, and the border country of British Columbia. It's a heavily mineralized area, and when you look across that country, Mike, and we've talked about other towns before. We talked about Rossland, and here's a shot of some of the mines in Red Mountain, and you know, this is spectacular rush. Spectacular rush into Rossland.
The Golden City, they call it.
Sure.
Lots of gold.
Yeah, in the 1890s. Then you go across to Greenwood, and this is right in the heart of the boundary country, sometimes at that time called the capital of the boundary country, and Greenwood was a typical Old West town, as this photograph shows you here. And you know, you look at Phoenix itself, and we've talked about Phoenix in other programs, and Phoenix was one of the storied towns of the West, and not even a ghost town now, it's a vanished town.
Now, we're talking, this place is named after a British Prime Minister, Gladstone. Any particular reason for that?
Well, you're getting into the story, Mike, and frankly, what we're talking about is we're talking about one inexperienced prospector and the other a very experienced prospector. One was a guy called William Minns, and he was an Englishman. He was young at the time. The date is 1909. And the other is an older prospector whom Minns refers to later on as McKenna. His name is probably McKinnon. He's an old Nova Scotian. He had prospected all through the American West, drifted up into Canada in 1909, met Minns, and they decided to prospect in a little place in that mineral-rich boundary country called Burnt Basin, or around Burnt Basin. So this is where the story starts, and this is where the story essentially finishes.
And it is the story of the last Gladstone Mine.
You're right.
And we're going to take a break right here, come back, and begin to tell you why you should pay close attention, because it could be worth millions if found today. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. We're talking about the lost Gladstone Mine. One of 7 out of 100 are any good, and this one's one of the good ones.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, you were mentioning that there was the big mineralization belt was Rossland, Phoenix, Greenwood. That's millions of dollars came out of that.
Hundreds of millions of dollars. Don't make a mistake.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
And there was a secondary mineralization belt?
Yeah, the first mineral belt went very close to the American border. But we have a second mineral belt. It's kind of tenuous, but it goes farther north than that and probably starts at Beaverdale. And here's a shot of the Sally Mine, which was part of the Highland Bell. Now, the Highland Bell produced 40 million ounces of pure silver.
And this is a secondary mineralization belt.
Quite a bit away from Greenwood, and quite a long way from Phoenix itself. And then you go across to the headwaters of what we used to call the North Fork, okay, which is now the Granby River, and you have the famous Union Mine. And here it shows the Union in all its glory, probably in the late 1920s. And the gold, now this is a gold mine, and kind of discovered by accident. And some of the gold ore in that, Mike, was averaging 42 ounces a ton, which is absolutely staggering. 1 ton of gold in certain instances out of the Union produced 100 ounces.
Now, when you're going like this is what we're talking about, a ton of gold. It's what, about 30
inches? A ton of ore would be about this.
30 by 30 by 30.
Yeah, approximately.
That's a ton, and in each one of those, there might be 40 ounces of gold.
Yeah, sometimes 100 ounces. $50,000 in today's funds.
In a block like this.
That's right.
So they're hauling this stuff out by the cartload.
They were indeed. So that's another occurrence. This is this odd place where, you know, you have the Union, you have the Highland Bell, and then you go over to Burnt Basin, and then beyond Burnt Basin, you go between Burnt Basin and Rossland was an old mine that I remember wandering around a lot when I was a kid, and this was the Velvet. And the interesting thing about the Velvet is it had the same type of ore as Rossland. And it was high up above Sheep Creek, Creek, and it was a very, very interesting mine. So Rossland and the Valley had copper gold ore, and this is what we're talking about in this particular case.
Okay, now you mentioned Burt Basin here. Now this is sort of a mountain range and a bit over from Christina Lake, east of Christina Lake.
Actually, Highway 3 goes right through Burnt Basin today. It didn't when I was a kid, but we would never have imagined that. So Burnt Basin, let's describe the area very, very quickly. There's Cascade City, and we discussed about Cascade City before. We had a program on it, and my old grandfather and grandmother owned the general store there. He was CPR agent. He was general factotum. He was...
there was a great ghost story, rolling a barrel up
That's
the...
right.
Ooh,
very interesting.
Gotcha, I remember that. Okay.
So Cascade, and then Christina Lake, and this time it's pretty rough. This shows Beach's store, Bill Beach's store. He was some kind of part-time storekeeper and mostly full-time smuggler, went to jail for it. But this is his store on the Valley Point in Christina Lake. And so this is, and then you go up into Burnt Basin itself, and you see this is about 1930 shot of the old Paulson Hotel. So there's Paulson up in Burnt Basin. Then there was a little old town that was there in the 1890s, and virtually nothing left today, Mike, called Gladstone, now known as Coryell. So
why the change?
Well, because British Columbia land surveyor came in, and his name was Coryell, and he decided he didn't like Gladstone. He liked Coryell a lot better.
I mean, I deserve to have something named after me, so he just changed it on his map.
Signpost is there today.
All right, so we're talking here 1909 into the Burnt Basin area, and this is sort of most major other discoveries have already been accomplished.
Sure. Burnt Basin is attractive because there's rich gold on the surface. So these two guys come in, and they make the acquaintance of the Jackson brothers. George Jackson is the younger brother, and they're parked there, the Jackson brothers in Burnt Basin, right near McCrae Creek. And McCrae Creek was named after Scott McCrae, the old individual I discussed in one other program years and years ago that came up with a song which he called the Miners Lament. And the Cowboys changed it to Home on the Range. Definitely a miners song. And I'll tell you why. Look at some of the words. There will never be heard a discouraging word. Miners don't want to hear that. Yeah. Right? They don't want to hear people say there's no gold up there.
Yes.
And the skies are not cloudy all day. Prospectors do not like to go out in the pounding rain. They would rather do it in better weather.
I think cowboys would probably have the same thing, but this is the Miners Lament that McCrae wrote, and that's the creek that they were staying on in the Jackson cabin.
That's right, and he discovered most of the mineralization in Burnt Basin. So they come into there, and this is going to be their headquarters. So
a guy named Minns, and he's a Brit without much mining knowledge.
Very, very green indeed. But on the other hand, McKenna or McKinnon is much more experienced. He knows, but they did make a mistake. They start out, cross McCrae Creek, and you can see McCrae Creek is pretty tough. There are some tough spots in McCrae Creek.
This is
I remember it very well. Sure it is. And the potholes and all this section down there. So, and there's gold in McCrae Creek as well, placer gold and hard rock gold. So they drift kind of in a northwesterly direction, and they think they're going to Gladstone Mountain, which is 7,350 feet tall. And that's a good place to have a vantage point to look over the entire country. And they're prospecting blind. They make two mistakes. One, they take enough food with them, they take enough equipment, they do not take a compass. They did not take a compass.
Now, this country's pretty well known. All the valleys are north and south. If you're climbing mountains, you're going to be able to look down to the north or the south.
That's what they think. So they go up to the top of this mountain, which may be Gladstone or it may be a mountain nearby called Badger. We don't know. We still don't know to this day. They look over and they see the mountain shears off about 2,000 feet. But they find a ridge and they go down this, they follow this ridge. And they think they're going down towards Christina Lake. And they spend some hours going through the bush. They've never been in this country before. They have no compass. Finally, they decide to take a break in the late afternoon. And they come to a waterfall that's about 20 or 30 feet high, and a little creek that they said was 3 or 4 feet. This is May, Mike. This may be a freshet, a spring freshet. They think they're on a creek called Sandner Creek, which is named after the Sandner family, which came into that country in the 1890s. They've been there for 100 years. And my family knew the Sandners extremely well. They are not on Sandner Creek, but they think they are.
You say this because what?
Because of later correspondence between Minns and George Jackson. Okay, we have the proof on that.
So they think they're on this Sandner Creek.
Right, and they notice some quartz nearby, and they notice some float, which is broken off a main body of a vein.
And somehow got to this location.
So they take some of that, and some of it's kind of an iron-capped ore. It looks like the ore from Rossland. And so McKinnon, or McKenna, he decides to knock off some of those pieces. He does. He takes a number of samples off this iron-capped ore. And he puts it in probably his packboard, and they start out again to go back to Coryell. And fortunately enough, they weren't sure of where they were going, and they arrived 6 miles above Coryell, above Paulson, in fact. And they realized they were way off, so they weren't oriented right, Mike. And so they eventually make their way down to the camp, down to Gladstone or Coryell, and back to the Jackson cabin. They show the Jacksons this ore, and the Jacksons are very impressed. But these guys are too cagey. They don't tell them where it comes from. But the Jacksons never forget it, especially George Jackson. So what happens is they make 2 more trips in the next year or 2.
They're able to find their way back to the same spot.
Yes, they were. They were. Now, that's surprising, because they weren't exactly sure where they were, but I think McKinnon probably had the better sense of bearings. And so they went back there, and each time they haul out some of that ore. Now, it's taken to Rossland, and it interests some individuals in Rossland, the old Golden City, and everybody's interested in gold in Rossland. And there's a high flyer there who wants to do it, and then he looks at the area and he says, "Oh, there are no roads in there," and there was only just a very poor tote road up Burnt Basin, you know, barely a path. And so he backs away, and then McKinnon takes the ore to Spokane. He doesn't really trust the Rossland assayers, I guess, so he goes to Spokane, an assayer he knows and trusts. And the guy returns. Now, this is not bonanza ore, which makes this story very believable. It's ore that averages just under 1/2 ounce of gold per ton, plus a significant amount of copper. And they couldn't remember exactly how much, but the assays came back consistently, $9 in gold, and gold was just over $20 an ounce then. Now, this is very good ore today.
With $500 an ounce Canadian for gold, this would be worth finding. But back in those days, it was probably, well, especially when you talk about that, what was the Union Mine was 50 ounces to the ton or 45 ounces to the ton?
Well, some of their selective ore was.
So this half ounce to the ton is not startling anybody.
But they contended, both Minns in his later letters, and we'll discuss those letters in some detail later on, and McKenna, there was a lot of ore in that particular area. There was a lot of quartz, which may have been barren quartz. They didn't think so, and certainly that iron-capped ore, which did carry values in gold and a high percentage of copper. So there they are, and what happens is Minns goes back to London. He is so keen on this and takes some of the samples with him. They're interested. But then a scandal hits the Canadian stock market in 1914, so he goes back about 4 or 5 years later, and they're not interested in investing in Canada, especially in British Columbia.
There's a war breaks out too, so
yes, of course. World War I breaks out. Minns, he joins up, and later he comes out of the war, and early, so I imagine he's wounded, but I'm not sure of that. And he goes to New Zealand, under soldier settlement of some type, and then transfers to Australia. And at the end of the war, George Jackson has never forgotten. He remembers the ore. The people in Cascade remember the ore. The people in Christina Lake remember the ore, and they remember it well in Rossland. So a number of people have seen the ore. They know it isn't exactly velvet ore. It is not ore from Red Mountain. These guys are not playing games. One of them went to England. One of them went to Spokane. They returned to the mine 2 different times. And so all of the individuals here, Mike, exist. There's no doubt about it.
This is one of the winnowing processes. I mean, if all of the people really exist, that makes it believable. If it's not some sort of astronomical find, it makes it more believable. And the fact they went in 3 times and refound it makes it believable.
And the letters are absolute, certain proof that this story is a fact.
Okay, now these letters are printed in this book, Christina Lake, and this book was written by Sandner. Now, didn't we have a creek named Sandner?
Lincoln Sandner is one of the children of old Charlie Sandner, who came there in, I believe, 1896. So Lincoln Sandner knows a lot about this, and the story we're going to discuss in absolute detail was written by Bruce Ramsay, who was a very prominent historian in British Columbia, a favorite of mine. He wrote books, Ghost Towns of British Columbia, some years ago. Very, very good, does good research, and the story and the proof are really quite amazing.
Okay, take a break. Be back in a second. We're going to read from the letters of Minns, which may lead us to, I'm sorry, the Gladstone Lost
Don't
Mine.
laugh. It's very serious stuff.
Okay. Welcome back to Gold Trails. We're telling the story today of the lost Gladstone Mine that a couple by the name of Minns and McKinnon figured that they found. And the veracity of this, I mean, if Bill hasn't already convinced you, there are letters written between Minns and Jackson, who we talked about at the beginning of the program, that elaborate on detail where this mine might be.
Okay, now remember that both of these individuals were, well, of course, Minns had been there, along with McKenna and
Three
McKinnon,
times at
right?
least, yep.
3 times at least. And Jackson had seen the ore. So Jackson traces Minns down and finally contacts him when he's in Australia. And this takes 1917, 1918, 1919, and 1920 before Jackson finally gives up on it. And Minns was so interested, he transfers power of attorney to Jackson. He wants to be cut in on the action. Minns has not forgotten. Here are some of the key elements of the story. Here's what Minns writes back to Jackson. He says to Mr. Jackson, they're very formal. He said, it was on this mountain after crossing Sandner Creek that we saw Christina Lake. And here we found the gold copper. He's referring to the ore. I think you will bear me out if you strike this particular mountain or divide. We did not cross over as our provisions were pretty short. It is rich-looking country. But he wasn't really sure where he was at.
No compass. They didn't take a compass. Right. So you don't think they crossed Sandner Creek?
I know they didn't cross Sandner Creek.
Because it doesn't have a waterfall on it.
That's right. And Sandner Creek is a much broader creek than that. In May, Sandner Creek roars. I've been there in May. Then he goes on to say this. I cannot recollect where you got my address from. I suppose Henry gave it to you, but do not remember writing to him from there. Mr. Ritchie is about the only man I wrote to from England in that district. That's my grandfather.
So Mr. Ritchie is your grandfather. There's another reason why you think this is a real...
Well, yeah. I mean, my grandfather had the post office in Cascade City. And here he is standing out in front of the store with his partner at that time, just after the turn of the century. And that's where the post office was. I remember it very well. He's the only man I wrote to from England in that district. If you should see him, will you kindly remember me to him? Also, Mrs. Minns sends her love to Mrs. Ritchie and says she wishes she was in dear old Cascade. Well, Cascade was, on that time, on the downhill slope. The powerhouse was still there, and the canyon, you know, the Cascade Gorge was still there, and there's a marvelous shot of the Cascade Gorge. And we stayed away from it very, very carefully when we were kids. Yeah. Then he goes on to say, later on in that year, we encountered it going back to Gladstone. That's this rocky country. If you remember that small waterfall falling over that bluff and running into Sandner Creek, wrong. You cannot mistake the mountain on which McKinnon and I staked the 2 claims. So they did stake 2 claims going up the mountain. You will find the creek, the steep bluff for 40 or 50 feet, and then it is a relatively easy climb. The claims are situated about halfway up, and the iron capped a solid mass over 20 feet wide. That's a pretty good occurrence of ore. We got our float just below. It averaged $9 in gold and some copper. I forget exactly. He did not remember how much copper. They were interested in gold. That's just fractionally under ½ an ounce of gold per ton. It's a good find.
Good modern find.
That's right.
$500 Canadian an ounce for the gold.
And then we get on, and they're still corresponding in 1918, 1919, and 1920. And this is a key to it, Mike. He says this. No, we did not see. I do not think we could see Fife, which was an old quarrying place up on the side of Christina Lake, or anything of Burt Basin Way, owing to what I think must be Gladstone Mountain.
So they couldn't see anything to the east.
That's right.
They couldn't see Fife. They couldn't see that.
Yeah. But after crossing the creek, and he still put Sandner Creek in brackets, and climbing about halfway up the next mountain facing us, we could see Christina Lake a long distance off to our left. But who knows? They may have been looking at the mid part of Christina Lake, and it is to their left. Yep. They may have been looking at the head of the lake where the Sandner property is. They may have been seeing Valley Point. We don't know, or Texas Point or English Point. We really don't know, and he really doesn't know. And then he goes on, and finally he says this. From the top of the divide, as you mentioned in the map, you can plainly see on a bright day a wide ledge. Brown in appearance, iron capping, and besides that capping, we took our samples with several pieces of float while approaching it and got an assay of gold, $9 or something in copper. He doesn't mistake it. He knows, he remembers that assay very well. I forget exactly what, as I only had the assay papers to look at. McKinnon took them into Spokane, but did not do anything with it. Although we had an offer from a man in Rossland if we could do some work on it and show it up. But the access was too difficult.
Yeah. But the thing is, I mean, he went and he thought he was on Gladstone Mountain, but if he wasn't there, logically, where would he have been? North of Gladstone Mountain, wouldn't he? I mean, your suggestion that he maybe went south, I don't think that wouldn't have happened. he would only gone further north and been looking back at Christina
Yeah,
Lake.
but did he go further north to the west or further north to the east? Remember, when he came out the first time, Mike, he was 6.5 miles above Corrield, or the old site of Gladstone itself.
Which is way north of
Way
Gladstone.
north of from where he left. So he turned in a big circle, as you're inclined to do sometimes without a compass. It's easy to say, you know, you should take your bearings and you remember it well for a year and maybe 5 years, but you're starting to go back 6, 7, 8, in this case about 10 years. His memory starts fading on him. There's no doubt about it. So I believe that A, he definitely did not cross Sandner Creek. B, he may or may not been on Gladstone Mountain. He may not have been. He may have been on Badger Mountain, as Jackson suggested to him. Now, all the details are in this book, and you know the book is still available in Grand Forks and the vicinity. So and it does give you everything you want. It tends to be a little confusing because certainly his memory is not as sharp as it should be, or I would expect it should be, although it's 10 years later, Mike.
Mm-hmm. But if we consider this to be a pretty good claim, and we consider it to be a
Very
verifiable and a story with veracity, what other kind of claims would match this half ounce to the ton? I mean, it strikes me that nickel plate in the later years was hauling out half an ounce to the ton gold.
You were a little more, actually. Nickel plate and the Headley Mascot, just fractionally over that.
So
that was very good. That went to depth. The mines in the Boundary, with some exception, the Union went to depth. Some of the mines in Phoenix went to depth. Some of them in Greenwood went to depth. Some did not go to depth. Certainly the Beaverdale mine, the Highland Belle, did go to depth. You know, relatively good depth. But some of those mines don't. They're very rich in the surface, and that's one of the flaws. But I don't think this mine has been discovered. Everyone who, when they prospect the Burnt Basin area, Mike, stays in Burnt Basin. They don't go much beyond it. There's a lot of country out there, and it's difficult to traverse. It really is.
And really the country we're talking about, if we take Highway 6, and you know you can head up Highway 6 as it climbs above Christina Lake, you actually, I think there's an indication where Polson is. If you think of heading north of that and then west to the northern part of Christina Lake, this is this up and down country we're talking about.
We're all guessing. Remember that some of these old timers, the Sandner family looked for it. The Jacksons looked for it. Other people from Christina Lake looked for it, and Cascade as well. There's a prospector came out of Cascade, I can't recall his name just now. He looked for it for years. They didn't find it. But remember, there are occasions where you will miss. You can miss by 20 feet in that country. It's rocky country, it's difficult to get into, and frankly, tough prospecting.
So the lost Gladstone Mine never was a mine, but because of the honesty of the players, the consistency of the story,
existence of the letters,
the reality of, you know, a second mineralization zone, and the existence of the letters leads you to believe it's there.
Sure, and I think signing the affidavit which turned over power of attorney to George Jackson was another indicator. He took all that trouble and paid for it himself and sent it back to Jackson and Burnt Basin.
Good stuff. Well, thank goodness for the Ritchie family who and all of the other connections that bring you to us finally. The lost Gladstone Mine in the Christina Lake area, one of the great stories from Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. See you next time.